On my 18th birthday, my parents told me they drained 95% of my trust fund for my sister's weddings. Hope you understand. So I took them to court and brought down everything they'd built. We need to talk about your trust fund, sweetheart. Those 9 words landed on my birthday cake like a grenade. The moment my mother spoke them, the foundation of my life crumbled, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. The air in the dining room felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. My mother, Sarah, gave me that tight-lipped smile she always saved for bad news wrapped in silk. My father, David, fiddled with his cufflinks, avoiding my gaze, a nervous habit I'd catalogued over 18 years of feeling like their invisible third daughter. Across the polished mahogany table, my sisters, Emily and Chloe, exchanged a knowing glance. It was the kind of look that screamed, they already knew whatever bomb was about to drop. Your grandmother established trust funds for all 3 of you girls before she passed, Sarah continued, slicing into her steak with surgical precision. Equal amounts. $200,000 each. I knew about Grandma Eleanor's gift. She'd told me herself during our last conversation in the hospice, her papery hand gripping mine with surprising strength. For your future, sweetheart. Nobody can touch it but you. The thing is, David finally spoke, his voice carrying that apologetic tone he reserved for moments when he'd already made a decision he knew I'd hate. Weddings are expensive. Emily's cost us nearly $180,000, and Chloe's was just over $200,000. The math hit me like a physical blow even before he finished speaking. They'd spent my trust fund on their weddings. We borrowed from it, Sarah corrected, as if semantics mattered, with every intention of paying it back. But the economy, your father's business downturn, the house renovations. How much is left? I asked, my voice flat. Silence. Emily suddenly found her napkin fascinating. Chloe excused herself to check on her husband, Alex, who was conveniently watching television in the other room. Sweetheart, you have to understand, David cleared his throat. Just under $11,000. $11,000 out of $200,000. 95% of my future spent on ice sculptures, designer gowns, and destination venues for sisters who'd never once remembered my birthday without a prompt from our mother. We hope you understand, Sarah added, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Family sacrifices for family. When you get married someday, your sisters will contribute to yours. I looked at Emily, who'd received a custom Vera Wang dress and a honeymoon in Bora Bora. At the empty chair where Chloe had fled rather than face me. At my parents, who genuinely seemed to believe this was reasonable. I understand perfectly, I said. And I meant it in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Michael Thorne, the attorney who'd handled Grandma Eleanor's estate. He'd given me his card at the funeral, pressing it into my palm with a meaningful look. Your grandmother wanted you to have options. Call me if you ever need them. I'd kept that card in my nightstand for 3 years, never imagining I'd actually use it. His office occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of place where the receptionist's outfit cost more than my entire wardrobe. But Michael himself was surprisingly approachable, mid-50s, reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead, and a handshake that conveyed genuine warmth. I've been expecting this call, he said, once I'd explained the situation. Your grandmother suspected something like this might happen. She did? He opened a file on his desk, thick, meticulously organized, with Grandma Eleanor's elegant handwriting visible on several pages. Eleanor came to me 6 months before she passed. She wanted to ensure her grandchildren's trusts were ironclad. Specifically, she was concerned about your parents' financial management. My grandmother had seen this coming. The realization sparked something between grief and vindication. The trust documents are clear, Michael continued. The funds were held in a custodial account, but they belong to you. Your parents were trustees, not owners. They had a fiduciary duty to preserve and protect those assets. Which means what they did wasn't just morally wrong. It was legally actionable. Breach of fiduciary duty, potentially conversion of assets, depending on how the court interprets their actions. He removed his glasses, polishing them with careful deliberation. Your grandmother also included a clause I've rarely seen. She called it her insurance policy. Michael slid a document across the desk. The language was dense, legalistic, but one paragraph stood out. Any trustee who misappropriates funds from this trust shall be personally liable for treble damages, attorney's fees, and costs, and shall forfeit any inheritance rights from the settler's remaining estate. Treble damages means triple the amount taken, Michael explained. And your grandmother's remaining estate is substantial. She placed the bulk of it in a separate trust, one your parents don't even know exists, with distribution contingent on their faithful execution of their duties as trustees. How substantial? Approximately $1.2 million. I sat back, processing. Grandma Eleanor hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a weapon. Before I could file anything, I needed information. The kind my parents would never willingly provide. Fortunately, being invisible has its advantages. For 18 years, my family had treated me as furniture. Present but unremarkable, easily overlooked. They discussed finances in front of me without caution. Left documents on the kitchen counter, stored passwords on sticky notes attached to the family computer. Over the next 3 weeks, while still living at home and pretending nothing had changed, I assembled a comprehensive picture of my parents' financial reality. I photographed documents, copied files to a flash drive, and cataloged everything in a secure cloud folder. What I discovered was far worse than simple mismanagement. David's business, a mid-sized construction company he'd inherited from his father, was hemorrhaging money. 2 major projects had gone catastrophically over budget. He'd taken out loans against the family home, against his retirement accounts, against everything except the assets he couldn't legally touch. Emily and Chloe's trust funds had been depleted years ago, with their knowledge and consent, to fund their educations and living expenses. Mine was supposed to be different. Grandma Eleanor had specifically designated it for my college education and establishment of independence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering that Emily's wedding, the one that supposedly cost $180,000, had actually been partially funded by an embezzlement scheme. David had been skimming from client deposits for years, using the money to maintain the family's lifestyle while his company crumbled. The forensic accountant Michael hired found discrepancies totaling nearly $400,000. My father wasn't just a thief who stole from his daughter. He was a criminal who'd stolen from dozens of families who trusted him to build their homes. I brought everything to Michael's office, spreading documents across his conference table like evidence in a major criminal case. This changes things significantly, he said, reviewing the bank statements, the doctored invoices, the email chains where David discussed creative accounting with his business partner, Robert Miller. We're not just looking at a civil matter anymore. I know. If you pursue this, it won't just be your trust fund you're recovering. It could mean criminal charges for your father. Prison time. The destruction of your entire family's financial structure. I thought about every birthday party where I'd been an afterthought. Every family vacation where my preferences were overruled by my sister's whims. Every college fund that mysteriously evaporated while Emily and Chloe's educations were fully funded. The way my mother had patted my hand and asked me to understand, as if my future were a reasonable sacrifice on the altar of family harmony. File everything, I said. The weeks before the lawsuit became public were the loneliest of my life, but also strangely the most clarifying. I worked 2 part-time jobs, mornings at a bakery near my apartment, evenings shelving books at the community college library. Neither paid well, but together they covered my rent and left enough for groceries if I was careful. My parents, absorbed in their own crumbling finances, never thought to check whether I was surviving. Emily and Chloe had their own problems. For the first time in 18 years, I was truly invisible. And I discovered that invisibility could be a gift. Without family obligations, I had time to think, to process, to excavate the memories I'd buried under years of trying to belong to people who'd never made space for me. I remembered my 13th birthday, the one where Sarah had scheduled Emily's bridal shower for the same afternoon. "You understand, sweetheart? We can do your thing next weekend." Next weekend never came. I remembered the college fund conversations, how my parents had discussed Emily's university tuition and Chloe's acceptance in front of me, never once mentioning what they planned for my education. When I finally asked at 16, my mother had looked genuinely confused. "Well, community college is perfectly respectable. Not everyone needs an Ivy League degree." I remembered finding my grandmother's last letter to my parents, hidden in my father's desk drawer during my evidence-gathering phase. She'd written it 2 months before her death. "I've watched you treat her as an afterthought for 17 years. If you touch her trust fund, I will ensure you lose everything. Consider this your only warning." David had filed it away and ignored it, confident that a dead woman's threats meant nothing. He'd been wrong. The letter gave me something I hadn't known I was missing: validation. Grandma Eleanor had seen what I'd seen. She'd known how my family treated me, and she'd tried to protect me from beyond the grave. Her preparations weren't paranoia. They were love transformed into legal armor. I started keeping a journal during those weeks. Not about the lawsuit or the family drama, but about who I wanted to become when this was over. The pages filled with dreams I'd never allowed myself to articulate: graduate school, maybe in social work or psychology, a career helping others navigate family trauma, a home of my own filled with books and plants and friends who chose to be there. A life defined by what I built, not what I survived. Michael called me on a Sunday morning, 3 days before the lawsuit was scheduled to be filed. "There's been a development," he said. "Robert Miller wants to meet with you." Why would I meet with my father's business partner? Because he claims to have information that will change how you view this entire situation. Information about your grandmother, about her relationship with your father, going back decades. I arrived at Michael's office that afternoon to find Robert already waiting. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-50s, with the kind of salt and pepper handsomeness that aging men sometimes acquire when they've taken care of themselves. His suit was expensive, but not ostentatious. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. "I know this is unconventional." Unconventional was one word for it. We settled into chairs across from each other, Michael positioned between us like a referee. "I've been your father's business partner for 23 years, Robert began. I know things about him that your mother doesn't, that your sisters don't, that even David himself may have forgotten or chosen not to remember. I'm listening. Your grandmother, Eleanor, and I corresponded for years. She reached out to me about a decade ago after noticing discrepancies in some family accounts she had access to. She saw me as someone on the inside who could warn her if David ever went too far. You were her informant. I was her ally. For years, I fed her information about your father's business practices, the corners he cut, the risks he took, the way he treated his employees. She used that information to protect what she could, including your trust fund." Michael leaned forward. "If you were working with Eleanor, why did you participate in covering up David's financial crimes?" Robert's expression grew pained. "Because I wasn't just covering for him, he was covering for me, too. Early in our partnership, I made some mistakes, cut corners on a project that could have gotten us both in serious trouble. David found out and used it as leverage. We've been trapped in a mutual destruction pact ever since. If I exposed him, he'd expose me. Neither of us could escape without destroying the other. Why come forward now? Because your grandmother asked me to. In her last letter, she told me that when the time came, when you were ready to fight, I should give you everything I had." He slid a flash drive across the table. Records going back to the beginning of our partnership. Every falsified document, every diverted payment, every conversation where David explicitly discussed defrauding clients. I've been organizing this file since your grandmother died, pulling together everything I collected over the years. What do you want in return? I want to turn state witness. I'll testify against David in exchange for immunity. It's the only way either of us survives this. The moral calculus was dizzying. Robert was a flawed man, complicit in crimes he claimed he'd been coerced into continuing. But his evidence could destroy my father's case entirely and potentially reveal the full scope of corruption I'd only glimpsed. I need time to think about this, I said. Take all the time you need. But know this, your grandmother loved you fiercely. She talked about you constantly in our correspondence. Said you were the only one who inherited her spine. Whatever you decide, Eleanor believed in you until her last breath. I left that meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a flash drive that would eventually unravel everything. The first lawsuit dropped like a thunderclap. I'd moved out by then, using the $11,000 remaining in my trust to secure a tiny apartment and cover living expenses while I started community college. My parents didn't even notice my absence for 3 days. When they finally called, it was to remind me about Emily's anniversary dinner, not to ask where I'd gone. The summons arrived on a Tuesday. I know because Chloe texted me 17 times in 2 hours, the messages escalating from confused to panicked to furious. What did you do? This is insane. You need to call Mom. Dad is having a breakdown. Please answer. I blocked her number and went back to studying for my statistics exam. What my family didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that I'd spent 18 years observing them, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their blind spots. They treated me like wallpaper, and wallpaper sees everything. The morning after the summons arrived, my mother called an emergency family meeting. I knew this because Emily's husband accidentally included me on a group text chain meant only for the adults. The message read, "Crisis mode. Mom's place 7 p.m. Do not mention this to her under any circumstances." I showed up at 6:45. The look on Sarah's face when I walked through the door was almost worth everything they'd stolen from me. She stood in the kitchen, wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, while David sat at the breakfast bar with his head in his hands. Emily and her husband occupied the living room couch, their body language screaming discomfort. Chloe paced by the windows, Alex trailing behind her like a confused puppy. "What are you doing here?" Emily demanded. "Family meeting, right?" "I'm still family. At least until the lawsuit is settled." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about this rationally. There has to be a way to work this out without involving lawyers and courts." "There was a way. You could have not stolen my inheritance." "We didn't steal. You took money that legally belonged to me. You spent it without my knowledge or consent. You failed to disclose the breach when I turned 18. I pulled a folded document from my jacket pocket. According to Texas trust law, that constitutes conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially fraud. Would you like me to continue, or should we just let the court sort it out?" The silence that followed was magnificent. Alex cleared his throat. "Look, I work in finance. Maybe I can look at the numbers and we can find some kind of settlement. You work at the same accounting firm that's been doing my father's books for 20 years. I'm not sure you're the neutral party you think you are." His face went pale. I'd struck something, though I didn't yet understand what. "How do you know where I work?" Alex asked, his voice carrying a tremor I hadn't expected. "I know a lot of things. For instance, I know that Dad's company has been operating at a loss for the past 7 years despite reporting profits to investors and the IRS. I know that Mom's boutique consulting business hasn't had a legitimate client since 2019. I know that Emily's first wedding, the one that got called off 3 weeks before the ceremony, still cost $90,000 that nobody ever talks about." Emily shot to her feet. "That's none of your business." It became my business when you used my money to pay for it. The revelation landed like a bomb. David's head snapped up. Sarah's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tile floor. Even Chloe stopped pacing, her face a mask of genuine shock. "Wait," Chloe said slowly. "The first wedding, her trust paid for that too?" Emily's silence was answer enough. "You told us that was covered by Brandon's family," Sarah whispered. "You said they insisted on paying since they called it off." "Brandon's family didn't pay for anything. I'd found the receipts during my document gathering, filed under Miscellaneous 2019. Emily had never expected anyone to look. They threatened to sue for fraud, actually, because Emily told them she was pregnant when she wasn't. Dad paid them off to keep it quiet. $50,000, also from my trust." The room erupted. Everyone was shouting at once. Sarah demanding explanations. David trying to calm the chaos. Emily screaming that I had no right to go through private documents. Alex looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. Chloe stood frozen, her expression cycling through disbelief and a dawning understanding that perhaps she didn't know her family as well as she'd thought. I walked out while they were still fighting. There was nothing more to say. The next few weeks taught me something valuable about family dynamics. Alliances shift quickly when money is involved. Chloe called me on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the family meeting implosion. Her voice carried none of the hostility I'd expected. "I need to talk to you. Not about the lawsuit. I know you won't discuss that. About something else." We met at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory. She arrived looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her usually perfect manicure chipped and neglected. "I've been going through Alex's files," she said without preamble. "After what you said at the meeting about him working at the same firm that handles Dad's books, I started wondering what else I didn't know. And he's been funneling money. Not just helping cover Dad's crimes. He's been skimming for himself. Small amounts spread across dozens of transactions going into accounts I've never seen before." She slid a manila folder across the table. "I found these hidden in his home office. I don't know what this means, but I think you should have it." I opened the folder. Bank statements, transfer records, account numbers that didn't match anything in our family's known finances. The documentation painted a picture of systematic theft that operated parallel to my father's embezzlement. "How did you find these?" "Alex keeps a locked filing cabinet in his office. I found the key in his sock drawer after what you said made me suspicious." She looked down at her hands. "I photographed everything and put the originals back. He doesn't know I found them." "Why are you giving this to me?" Chloe's composure cracked. "Because I'm pregnant. 12 weeks. And I just realized I'm married to someone I don't know at all. And my parents are people I'm not sure I ever knew. And you're the only person in this family who's ever told me the truth, even when it was brutal." I studied my sister across the table. We'd never been close. She'd been 6 when I was born, more interested in friends and boys than a squalling infant sister. By the time I was old enough to remember, she was already gone. First to college, then to her own life. We'd been strangers sharing a last name. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing. She pressed her palms against her eyes. "I want to do one right thing. Maybe that starts with helping you." I took the folder. "Are you going to leave him?" "I don't know yet. But I'm not going to warn him about this." She stood, gathering her purse. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for the lawsuit, I still don't fully understand all of that. But for never seeing you. For treating you like you were just there." After she left, I sat with the documents for a long time. The information changed everything. Alex wasn't just complicit in covering up my father's crimes. He was actively stealing from the company's client accounts, using his position to siphon funds that David didn't even know were missing. Two predators circling the same wounded prey, neither realizing the other existed. Michael's reaction to the new evidence was measured, but intense. "This is bigger than your trust fund," he said, spreading Chloe's documents across his conference table alongside the files I'd already gathered. "We're looking at a criminal conspiracy involving at least 3 parties, your father, Robert Miller, and Alex. Potentially others we haven't identified yet." "What does this mean for my case?" "It means leverage. Alex is going to want to avoid prosecution even more than your father does. If we approach him correctly, he might become a cooperating witness. He's married to my sister. She's pregnant. He's also been stealing from your family for years while smiling across the Thanksgiving table. Loyalty only extends so far in situations like this." Michael was right. 2 days after we sent Alex a carefully worded letter outlining what we knew, he appeared at the office with his own attorney, ready to negotiate. The conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end, we had a signed statement detailing every financial crime Alex had witnessed or participated in over the past decade. The document implicated not just my father and Robert, but also 2 city councilmen who'd accepted bribes to approve David's building permits, a bank manager who'd falsified loan documents, and a property appraiser who'd been systematically overvaluing David's developments. The web of corruption extended far beyond one family's dysfunction. My father had built an empire on fraud, and everyone around him had been either complicit or willfully blind. "One more thing," Alex said as he was leaving. "Chloe's pregnancy. The baby is mine, right?" His attorney tried to intervene, but Alex waved him off. "I deserve to know. She had a paternity test done last week just to be certain." "Given everything," I said, "it's yours. Whatever else is happening, that child is biologically connected to both of you." Something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, or the ghost of genuine emotion. Then it vanished, replaced by the careful blankness of a man calculating his remaining options. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never touched your trust fund. That was all David and Sarah." "I know. That's the only reason you're walking out of here instead of being arrested." My parents' desperation manifested in increasingly creative ways. First came the letters, handwritten pleas from Sarah. Initially apologetic, then accusatory, then bizarrely nostalgic. She wrote about my first steps, my kindergarten graduation, the time I'd won a spelling bee in 4th grade. As if recounting happy memories could somehow offset the fundamental betrayal at the heart of our relationship. Then David's attorney proposed a settlement, full repayment of the original $189,000 they'd taken, plus interest, in exchange for dropping all claims to Grandma Eleanor's hidden estate. They still believed the $1.2 million was somehow negotiable, not understanding that a trust forfeiture clause had already sealed their fate. I declined without counter-offering. The harassment phase came next. Emily launched a social media campaign painting me as a vindictive child destroying her family over money. She created fake accounts to leave negative reviews on my apartment complex, my community college professors, even the coffee shop where I studied on weekends. She filed a police report claiming I threatened her, which was quickly dismissed when she couldn't produce any evidence. Her husband, now her ex-husband-to-be, as the divorce proceedings had begun, reached out to Michael seeking his own deal. He had information about David's construction defects, buildings that had been approved despite failing safety inspections. The details were technical, but damning: load-bearing walls with inadequate support, electrical systems that violated code, plumbing installed by unlicensed workers. "How many buildings are we talking about?" I asked. 17 residential complexes. Over 300 units total. 300 families living in homes my father had knowingly built to substandard specifications. 300 families who could be at risk if anything went wrong. I authorized Michael to contact the city's building inspection department. The resulting investigation made the news within a week. David's criminal charges expanded to include reckless endangerment. Through all of this, one question haunted me: how had my grandmother known? Eleanor had died 3 years before I turned 18 and discovered the theft. She'd written the forfeiture clause and established the hidden estate years before David's business troubles became acute. Either she possessed remarkable foresight, or she'd known something specific that had informed her precautions. The answer came from an unexpected source: my grandmother's former housekeeper, a woman named Martha, who had worked for the family for over 30 years. She reached out after seeing the news coverage, leaving a message with Michael's office. We met at a diner near the house where I'd grown up. Martha was in her 70s now, gray-haired and grandmotherly, but her eyes were sharp as she stirred her coffee. Your grandmother suspected your father of financial impropriety as early as 2010. She said she hired a private investigator that year after noticing discrepancies in some family accounts she had access to. What did the investigator find? Enough to convince her that David was not a trustworthy steward of money, but not enough to prove criminal activity. Not then. She decided to protect what she could and wait. Wait for what? For you to grow up. Martha smiled sadly. She used to tell me about you. Said you were the only one of her grandchildren who actually listened. The only one who sat with her and asked questions instead of just waiting for presents. She believed you'd be the one strong enough to do what needed to be done. When the time came, I thought about my grandmother, the smell of her perfume, the strength in her papery hands, the way she pressed that lawyer's card into my palm at the funeral. She'd been preparing me for this moment for years. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every carefully casual mention of financial independence had been building toward this confrontation. One more thing, Martha said as we prepared to leave. Your grandmother left me something to give you when the time was right. I've been holding on to it since she passed. She handed me a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in Grandma Eleanor's distinctive script. I opened it in my car alone, tears streaming down my face before I'd finished the first paragraph. My dearest girl, she'd written, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have been confirmed, and my best hopes about you have proven true. You are stronger than they ever knew. You are smarter than they ever acknowledged, and you are more loved than you have ever been allowed to feel. The path ahead will be difficult, but you will not walk it alone. Trust Michael. I chose him specifically for you. Trust yourself. And when all of this is over, build a life that would make me proud. You already have. Love always and forever, Grandma. The civil suit alleged breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, fraud, and intentional interference with inheritance rights. It named both parents as defendants and sought treble damages under Grandma Eleanor's trust provisions, meaning I was asking for $567,000, plus attorney's fees, plus forfeiture of their rights to the hidden estate. But that was just the opening salvo. 3 days later, the State Attorney General's office received an anonymous tip regarding financial irregularities at David Mercer Construction. The documentation was thorough, damning, and impossible to ignore. My mother showed up at my apartment a week after the subpoenas went out. I'd never seen Sarah look anything less than perfectly composed. Her armor was designer clothing and immaculate makeup, a shield against any suggestion that her life was less than ideal. But the woman standing in my doorway had bloodshot eyes, smeared mascara, and a desperation that bordered on manic. You need to stop this, she said, pushing past me without invitation. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now call off your lawyer before you destroy this family. I'm not destroying anything. I'm recovering what was stolen from me. Stolen? She laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. We raised you, fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years, and you're going to sue us over money? Over $200,000 that Grandma specifically left for my future. Money you had no legal right to touch. Your grandmother was a vindictive old woman who never approved of your father. She set up those trusts specifically to cause problems. She set them up to protect her grandchildren. You're the one who turned it into a problem by stealing from me. Sarah's face contorted, the mask finally cracking. Your sisters needed those weddings. Emily's marriage was struggling. We thought a beautiful ceremony would help. And Chloe, she always dreamed of something spectacular. What were we supposed to do? Tell them no? You could have used your own money, or told them the truth about Dad's business, or asked me if I minded having my entire future liquidated to fund their parties. I kept my voice level, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was seeking. But you didn't do any of those things because you didn't think my future mattered. Emily got nearly $200,000 for her wedding. Chloe got the same. I got a pat on the hand and an expectation to understand. The math is pretty clear about where I ranked in this family. For a moment, something flickered across my mother's face. Guilt, perhaps, or the dim recognition that she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Then it vanished, replaced by cold fury. If you go through with this, you won't have a family anymore. I never had one to begin with. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone anticipated. Robert Miller turned state's witness within a month of the initial inquiry. Faced with the prospect of federal charges for wire fraud and tax evasion, he produced records dating back 15 years, documenting a systematic pattern of embezzlement, bid rigging, and money laundering that made my trust fund theft look like petty cash. My father was arrested on a Thursday morning. Perp walked out of his own office building while news cameras captured every humiliating moment. The footage played on every local station. Emily's husband, who worked in commercial real estate, found his own business relationships suddenly cooling. Alex was quietly asked to resign from his position at the accounting firm where he'd been employed since college. I watched it all from my tiny apartment, eating ramen noodles and feeling nothing but grim satisfaction. But the real revelation came during the discovery process of my civil case. Michael's forensic accountant had been digging through years of financial records, tracing the flow of money through various accounts and shell companies. The pattern that emerged was damning. My trust fund hadn't just been spent on weddings and payoffs. A significant portion had been used to cover losses from David's failed developments, losses he'd hidden from investors by falsifying financial reports. The fraud extended further than I'd imagined. My father had been running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme, using new client deposits to cover losses on previous projects while skimming enough to maintain the family's lifestyle. The whole edifice had been crumbling for years, held together by lies and stolen money, including mine. The trial lasted 6 weeks. My parents' legal strategy collapsed almost immediately when their lead attorney discovered the full scope of David's criminal exposure and withdrew from the case. They cycled through 3 more lawyers before finding someone willing to represent them, a semi-retired defense attorney who seemed more interested in billing hours than mounting an actual defense. I testified for 2 days. Every document I gathered, every financial irregularity, every conversation I'd overheard was laid out for the jury with clinical precision. Michael questioned me gently, drawing out the narrative of a childhood defined by exclusion and a betrayal that extended far beyond money. Emily and Chloe both testified for our parents. Their loyalty would have been touching if it weren't so clearly motivated by self-interest. They'd both received substantial financial support that could potentially be clawed back if the court found fraud. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Martha, my grandmother's former housekeeper, appeared on the 4th day of trial. She'd witnessed years of family dynamics, heard countless conversations, and understood better than anyone the systematic way I'd been diminished. David used to refer to her as the spare, Martha testified, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I heard him say it to Sarah once when they didn't know I was in the next room. He said their youngest was the spare and that her grandmother's gift would be better spent keeping the family together. The spare. Like furniture. Like something you keep around just in case, but never actually value. I sat in that courtroom and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, that had burned down to embers months ago. Something more like clarity, the understanding that I'd spent 18 years trying to earn a place in a family that had never intended to make room for me. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict in my favor on all counts. The judge awarded the full triple damages plus attorney's fees plus costs. My parents were ordered to pay $834,000, money they didn't have and never would. The day the verdict was read, I sat in that courtroom and felt the weight of 3 years lift from my shoulders. Michael squeezed my hand under the table. A small gesture, but one that meant everything. We'd done it. But the legal victory was only part of the story. What happened next would test everything I thought I knew about justice, revenge, and the complicated terrain between them. The real punishment came in the separate ruling regarding Grandma Eleanor's hidden estate. By violating their fiduciary duties, David and Sarah had forfeited all rights to the $1.2 million. That money now belonged to the trust's sole contingent beneficiary, me. The aftermath unfolded over the following year like dominoes falling in slow motion. David's criminal trial resulted in a conviction for wire fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to 48 months in a federal prison in Ohio. My mother filed for divorce while he was awaiting transfer. Not out of moral outrage, but because divorcing him allowed her to shield some assets from seizure. She'd always been practical that way. I realized loyalty had its limits, especially when money was involved. The ripple effect spread further than I'd anticipated. Robert Miller's testimony had implicated not just my father, but an entire network of corruption that extended into local government. 2 city councilmen resigned. The bank manager who had falsified loans was indicted separately. Even Alex, despite his cooperation, faced professional sanctions that effectively ended his career in finance. But it was the building inspection scandal that drew the most public attention. The 17 residential complexes my father had constructed with substandard materials became front-page news. Families were evacuated while engineers assessed structural integrity. 3 buildings required immediate remediation. The class action lawsuit from affected residents would eventually settle for $12 million. Money that would come from liquidating every asset my father had ever owned, plus insurance policies he'd fraudulently obtained. The family home sold at auction. I didn't attend, but Michael told me later that my mother had watched from across the street as strangers carried out furniture she'd spent decades acquiring. Sarah had always cared about appearances above all else. Losing the house meant losing the facade she'd built her identity around. Emily's husband filed for divorce 3 months after the criminal trial concluded, citing irreconcilable differences, but clearly motivated by the social and professional fallout of his association with our family name. Emily herself went through what I can only describe as a complete psychological unraveling. She'd built her identity on being the golden child, the successful one, the daughter whose wedding had been worth bankrupting her sister's future. When that pedestal crumbled, she had nothing underneath. I heard through various channels that she'd moved into a small apartment, was working retail, and had stopped speaking to our mother entirely. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at her fall. Instead, I felt something closer to pity, not for who she'd become, but for who she might have been if our family had valued honesty over appearance. Chloe's situation was more complicated. She'd given birth to a healthy daughter 3 months before the criminal trial. And despite everything, she and Alex were attempting to co-parent amicably. His testimony had helped destroy our father, but it had also potentially saved him from prison. She told me later that she'd never fully forgive him, but she'd learned to compartmentalize for their daughter's sake. Some days I look at him and see the man who lied to me for years, she admitted during one of our cautious coffee meetings. Other days I see the father of my child trying to do better. I haven't figured out which version is real yet. Maybe both of them are. The honesty of that statement struck me. Chloe had spent her whole life performing the role of perfect daughter, perfect wife, perfect woman. Watching her wrestle with ambiguity, admitting she didn't have answers, felt like witnessing someone wake up from a long sleep. I finished my community college degree during the trial, then transferred to a 4-year university. The scholarship I'd earned through academic performance covered tuition, while Grandma Eleanor's estate covered everything else. Michael helped me invest wisely, and we developed something I'd never expected, a genuine mentorship that went beyond attorney and client. My mother reached out exactly once, 18 months after the trial. A handwritten letter asking if we could meet. She wanted to apologize, she said, to explain, to see if there was any path toward reconciliation. I thought about it for 3 days before writing back. The letter I sent was brief. You asked me to understand when you stole my future to pay for parties I wasn't invited to plan, attend, or enjoy. I understand now. I understand that love isn't measured in sacrifices. It's measured in who you sacrifice and who you protect. You chose to sacrifice me, and you chose to protect everyone else. That choice has consequences. I hope you can understand. I never heard from her again. What I haven't told you yet is what happened in the quiet moments, the spaces between courtroom battles and family explosions, where I had to figure out who I was becoming. The money from Grandma Eleanor's estate changed my external circumstances dramatically, $1.2 million deposited into accounts with my name on them. Enough to pay for any education I wanted. Enough to buy a house, travel the world, never worry about rent again. The kind of financial security I'd never imagined having. But money doesn't heal. It doesn't fill the hollow spaces where family love should have been. It doesn't answer the questions that kept me awake at night. Was I wrong to destroy them? Did they deserve all of this, or just some of it? Am I a hero or a monster? Michael understood. Maybe better than anyone. We'd started meeting monthly for dinner. Professional at first, gradually becoming something more like friendship. He'd spent decades watching families tear themselves apart over money, watching people make choices that seemed rational in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect. Do you ever regret it? I asked him one evening, about a year after the trial. Taking my case, helping me destroy my own family? He considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary at all. But your grandmother believed you deserved justice, and she was right. The destruction wasn't caused by you filing a lawsuit. It was caused by years of fraud, theft, and betrayal. You just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. How did you know I was ready? I didn't. I knew Eleanor believed you would be, and I trusted her judgment. He smiled slightly. She was right about everything else. Why not that? The faith my grandmother had placed in me across years, through her death, into the hands of an attorney she'd chosen specifically for this moment, was perhaps the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. She'd seen something in a quiet, overlooked child that even the child herself couldn't see. She'd built an elaborate safety net, trusting I'd find my way to it when the time came. I spent a lot of time in that first year visiting her grave. Not to talk, that seemed performative somehow, but just to sit, to be present in the space where her body rested, thinking about the person she'd been and the person she believed I could become. Some days I brought flowers. Other days I just sat in silence, letting the grief and gratitude wash through me in equal measure. But here's the part that might surprise you. The ending nobody expected, least of all me. 3 years after the trial, I received a call from an unknown number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Jessica Lee, an investigative journalist working on a story about financial crimes in the construction industry. She'd stumbled across my family's case while researching a larger pattern of fraud and wanted to interview me. I almost declined. The wound had closed, the scar tissue forming something almost like acceptance. Why reopen it for someone else's story? But something made me agree. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the lingering sense that the truth fully told might help someone else recognize the warning signs I'd missed. The interview lasted 6 hours. Jessica was thorough, compassionate, and genuinely interested in understanding the human cost of financial betrayal. When we finished, she asked if I had any questions for her. Just one, I said. How did you find this case? There must be hundreds of fraud convictions you could have focused on. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed me an email. It had been sent to her publications tip line 3 years ago, the week after my trial concluded. The sender had provided detailed information about the case, suggested it as a starting point for a larger investigation, and included a single personal note: "This is my daughter's story. She deserves to have it told by someone who will do it justice." The sender's email address was a generic Gmail account, but the IP address, Jessica explained, had been traced to a federal correctional facility in Ohio. My father. From prison. Facing the consequences of his own choices, he'd reached out to ensure my story would be heard. Not as an apology. Nothing could apologize for what he'd done. But as acknowledgement, as the admission that I had never been the spare, that my life had value he'd been too selfish and too desperate to protect. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. It didn't change what he'd done. Didn't excuse it. Didn't even require forgiveness. But it gave me something I hadn't known I needed, the understanding that somewhere in the wreckage of everything he destroyed, my